Andrew Critchlow, welcome back to BRI Dialogues. You're the first guest to appear 2 times, not only in one episode, in 1 week. And how ironic that we were talking about energy and the future of global energy markets, and you're sitting in UK and your house lost power. I don't think Woody Allen or Oliver Stone, if they were part of our team, could have arranged it that way. So lovely to have you back with us. To pick up where we left, I just kick off with one question. There's a lot of talk right now about weaponization of finance and the role of dollar. But in your view as an expert, aren't commodities, in a sense, oil and gas, minerals, in their own way currency in the future? And isn't this going to be a dilemma for the West and in light of recent crises? And how are we going to arrive to a balance between the needs of the world, the ramifications of sanctions, and the future of energy markets? As you know, the price of commodities today in food markets is shooting to the roof, and then next it's minerals. What is the role of commodities, in your view, Andrew, in the bigger dynamics from energy all the way down?
It's a very good point. And I think that the role of commodities in currencies and foreign exchange as a whole, historically, there's always been a very strong link, because currencies since the dawn of financial systems, let's say, have been underpinned by a commodity, and a precious commodity in the sense of gold or a metal or a finite resource. And I think that link, which was somewhat broken when major currencies left the gold standard in the early part of the last century, that link, in many respects could be reestablished, because globally currencies have effectively been devalued. And they've been devalued by successive financial shocks. And in the near term, those financial shocks, if we go back to 2008, have just kept coming and coming. And then the recent financial shock was the global pandemic. The response from policymakers and central bankers has been to pump more money into the system via quantitative easing and other financial measures. Ultimately, they're doing the same thing that governments have done historically for centuries, if not thousands of years. They ultimately are debasing their own currencies. Previously, it used to be medieval lords putting less silver in their coinage. Now it's less hard currency in the form of gold in central banks. So yeah, I think the link between commodities and currencies is going to strengthen over time, because the demand for commodities is only going to increase. And it comes back to my initial point at the start of the podcast around the big fundamental problem that the world faces is, how do we provide economic growth for a rising population of 9 billion people, given that everyone's going to need more food, everyone's going to need more energy and resources, and we really live in we live on a small planet with finite resources. So I think it's really important. Now, the dollar's role in commodity trading is absolutely essential, and it has been since the beginning of the last century, when oil began its rise to become the primary energy source driving global economies alongside coal. Now, I think that is being challenged, and there's a number of reasons why that's being challenged. One, the demand drivers for these commodities is going to shift. It's going to shift to Asia, and China, for example, has already indicated that it wants to develop its own platform for trading and the commerce of currencies via RMB. It's launched with mixed success in Shanghai, crude contracts that are tradable in local currency. In many respects, what we're seeing now aimed at Russia in terms of limiting its access to US dollars, and then the Russian response is forcing buyers to transact in rubles. Again, it's is this something that will backfire on the US? Will it backfire on the West ultimately? Because it just pushes the resource holders to actually say, well, we're only going to transact now in our own currency because that strengthens our own currency. So it's very complicated. You look at the major producers of the Middle East, in the Gulf, all their currencies are pegged to the US dollar because oil still provides the bulk of their foreign exchange earnings. Their sovereign wealth funds, which have been stocked historically since the 1970s when they were created, are all those assets are held in dollars.
So Andy, let me ask you this question. I know Anush is going to jump while you're in Middle East, and I will be quick. So is Saudi in effect playing Russian roulette in deciding to sell its oil in yuan? And how risky is that, and how tangible is that? Talking about?
Well, they're not selling their oil in yuan yet, but it doesn't rule out the possibility that they could in the future.
That's what I mean.
The Chinese have certainly approached Saudi Arabia with the idea that China could buy Saudi oil long term over a 10-year period in very large quantities. For example, how would that be paid for? And would it be paid for in dollars, or would it be paid for in yuan? Would the Saudi government accept yuan? Of course, if you look at demand and the markets that Saudi is going to have to compete for against its major trading competitors like Iran, like other Gulf state oil producers, then it's China that's the market that they have to own. So, foreseeably that could happen in the future. Likewise, Gulf producers could maybe in the future, and this is a long way in the future, we may see examples where commodities are traded for in cryptocurrency, and maybe that is a new way to transact. But we're not at that point yet at all, I don't think.
But Andy, at the end of the day, you could have a basket of currencies, so it doesn't have to be either or, and that's probably what the commodity producers will begin to look at. But looking at the state of Russia and the prospects of the economy, I'd much rather deal in salt with Russia than with rubles. And anyone in the right mind, I suspect, will not accept trading in rubles because they are practically worthless. The only reason why they're floating anywhere is because the central government is shaping the value of the ruble. It's not the same for the yuan, of course. Yuan is a very different thing. But given that, countries still need to deal with the Western economies, that they may balance between the dollar and the euro. But if they've got a basket, then obviously yuan would have to be a member of it. But I don't see these countries being forced to make a choice between these. What they will do is dump valueless currencies like a ruble, I suspect, right?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And President Biden in the US, I think he referred to the ruble as the ruble. And although the value of the currencies bounced back over the last week, certainly as the concept of using the ruble as an international currency of trade, that's not going to happen, even though Russia on net terms is the biggest global exporter of net commodities, and that's everything from oil, gas through to metals and agricultural goods. So but its currency isn't going to be accepted as an international currency of trade. And I think your point about a basket of currencies, this is something that's been floated for many years, and the Gulf states via the GCC have talked about this at length. The discussions around creating a unified GCC currency along the lines of the euro predate actually the creation of the euro. But that, again, I think is very much tied up to the denomination of the majority of Gulf states' foreign assets, which are held in sovereign wealth funds, which are in many ways are denominated in dollars. If it's not cash, then the equities that those sovereign wealth funds invest in, they tend to be US listed or listed on European exchanges. So their exposure overall is really to the US dollar. So if major countries like Saudi Arabia, the big oil producers of the region, were to depeg, they would effectively devalue their own sovereign wealth funds in a way because of the impact that would have on the dollar as a currency. I don't see it happening in my lifetime. But as that relationship between oil demand growth, which we talked at in part one, in part one of the podcast, as that starts to peak, and then eventually we crest that peak and decline as you move to 2050 and net zero, and this is dependent on countries sticking to their pledges made in COP26, sticking to pledges to reduce emissions, which is a big if. Then the relationship between these major producers in the Middle East and their traditional partners, the US, OECD nations, that changes, because those countries are no longer going to be demand growth drivers.
Right.
They're going to all those demand growth drivers are going to come from Asia.
Yeah.
So then will we see a change in how they view this debate over whether to move to a basket of currencies, whether to maintain their pegs to the US dollar? And that's going to be a pretty profound change that's going to happen.
But given that China itself holds much of its reserves in Western currencies, dollar in particular, they're not going to want the world to suddenly start using the yuan and see their trillions of dollars devalued overnight, right?
No, not in the current paradigm. But this assumes that relations between China, the West, remain cordial. It assumes that the many geostrategic hotspots between China and the US don't get hotter. And I think that if there's one lesson that we've seen from, well, I actually take this back to 2010 and to the Arab Spring, because I remember at that time, I was often asked, at the beginning of the Arab Spring, is this serious? Is this going to turn into something serious? And my view was no, because the Gulf states they'll pump money into these regimes, they'll calm things down, we'll calm things down in Egypt, and it just didn't happen. And I was actually surprised that what started out as bread riots, that it turned into this movement, which actually at one point, it did reach into the Gulf states, and it did really cut to the heart of these major oil producing countries, whether they choose to admit it or not. And so the point is that we've been proved wrong since 2010 on so many issues that we thought this will never happen. And I think that in many ways what we're looking at now are shifts in paradigm shifts, right, in the way the world works.
But sitting in Beijing, though, I mean, I particularly like China's version of globalization. I sympathize with their take on. I think in many ways they are the most honest globalizer that there is, and their approach is very sound. But if I was sitting in Beijing, I would be really worried about what is going on now, not just in terms of changes in energy patterns that Europe in particular, and also US increasing fracking and supplying energy to Europe as well, but also some of the traditional suppliers of China that become accustomed to now finding that actually the traditional markets in the West are again open for business. But that's just part of it. For example, Qatar and Iran and others begin to look at Europe as hugely lucrative market for gas in particular. But of course, for China, energy is just one input in its massive industrial development. Looking at everything else which is going on in relation to the war and Russia's isolation, how do you think China is going to manage this difficult position of keeping Russia afloat, but also having to manage the very damaging consequences of Putin's war in terms of China's own economy and interests globally?
I think the evidence from what we've seen so far is that this is actually moving China closer to Russia. And there's a couple of points here. If you look at both these countries and how they approach, say, the Middle East, both in many ways have similar objectives, but they have gone around it in different ways. Russia 2010 saw an opportunity to re-establish itself as a major player post-Soviet Union in the region, and it did that via Libya and direct military intervention via proxies. It did it via Syria, direct military intervention. In doing that, it showed to the power brokers in the region, namely Saudi Arabia and some of the other Gulf states, that Russia had the ability and the political will to project its force to achieve its foreign policy goals. Twin track, Russia opened up in 2015 an economic dimension whereby it signed up to a pact, an oil producing pact with OPEC, which was previously never thought of. OPEC had previously very much viewed Russia with suspicion, although they had been approached by Russia previously about an alliance. There wasn't a great deal of political motivation to pursue this within the OPEC group. That changed. So this gave Russia two pillars upon which to stand its foreign policy in the Middle East and intersect itself as a state actor in the region that had previously been dominated entirely by the US and post-colonial states such as the UK, OECD nations in Europe, etc. Then on the other side, you have China. Similar goals. How does China intersect into this critically important region for energy supply going forward, given the realities that these oil producing states have traditionally for the last 50 years been client states of the US and these OECD nations? And it did it via money. It did it via investment and money, and it did it by the Belt and Road Initiative in many respects, by building these trade bridges with the awareness that Gulf states could see what was coming over the horizon, which is energy transition, which is in the US, for example, the rise of shale, a greater focus on energy independence, being able to produce domestic energy, the twin track being eventually decarbonization, and we reduce our dependence on Middle East oil, which has for decades been a yoke around the neck of many US administrations. The idea of the US putting boots on the ground in the Middle East is not politically a vote winner, any US president, but they've successively done it. So China saw this as opportunity, build this bridge, this pathway, so that Middle East oil producing nations can see a future for their main export product for many, many years to come, China. And then on the other side of that road, build a bridge for Chinese investment to come into the Middle East. And you saw it from 2005, things like the opening of the Dragon Mart in Dubai, which is a big economic free zone on the edge of Dubai. Started out with very humble beginnings, just small traders from China coming in, opening a representative office. But actually, it was far more symbolic what that meant, because it opened up a pathway for Chinese nationals to come into the UAE, for example, but also for Chinese goods to come into the UAE in ever greater quantities. And then from there, we saw China invest in real estate. We saw China invest increasingly in energy. We saw Chinese oil companies come increasingly into the region, take strategic stakes in important field developments in the region. And then we get to now where actually you have a full retreat from the US and Europe from the region in many respects, despite the rhetoric. The realities on the ground are that China has really positioned itself now as a primary partner, when previously it was probably a secondary partner 15, 20 years ago. I think the same for Russia, because actually I look at OPEC and I think it's by far the most meaningful economic intergovernmental institution in the world, in terms of it can change the economic realities for hundreds of billions of people purely by increasing or decreasing oil supply. The IMF can't do that. The European Union can't do that. No central bank in the world actually at the moment can do that, because they are actually fiddling at the fringes. But whereas OPEC in one foul swoop can actually have a massive impact on people's lives, and Russia has, a leading voice at the table. So you have this. I think that this comparison between the two, both have the same goals and have achieved them. One, China has done it through economics and trade, and Russia has done it by this sort of blend of realpolitik and boots on the ground matched with real economic kind of might via OPEC. Very interesting.
Very interesting the way you packed it and combined it. And I think that I couldn't agree more with what Anush said about the nervousness that is rattling Beijing at the moment about their reserves. Like if anything happens on Southeast China Sea, you know, tomorrow with Taiwan, what is going to happen to their reserves? But I want to take the conversation to two dimensions, if I may, Andy, and I need your guidance. Let's say this conflict sadly is prolonged for whatever reason. Nord Stream 1 and 2 are, you know, clipped, ostracized. How quickly those capacities can be shifted through this Power of Siberia pipeline and across the Japan Sea to China from a real politic as well, as you rightly said. The second question I have is that given the inflationary problems in Europe and in West at the moment, is the idea of onshoring for manufacturing, again, a bygone in light of energy scarcity and, you know, the long-term contracts? Even Qatar cannot start shipping tomorrow because they've locked themselves to agreements with China. How these two fit together? And then I have something else that I will keep for a next question of Anush and then jump in.
Yeah, I mean, things take a long time to build and longer than people think. If you look at say, in the global mining industry and some of the critical metals like copper, for example, you know, copper, unlike iron ore, it's a finite commodity. It's actually in fairly short supply given the demand. If you look at a normal internal combustion engine vehicle, it takes about 35 kilograms of copper. Move that to an electric vehicle and it goes up to 75. So, you know, you're more than doubling the amount of copper content that's going to be needed in the future to meet road transport. But you know, there are copper deposits out there that are untapped, but it takes at least 10 years to put a world scale mine into operation. And that's, you know, aside from actually getting the finance and all the agreements in place to actually do that with the stakeholder, it takes a very long time for these industries to shift. These are not commodities industries, are not industries that pivot on a coin. It's not like tech. It's the same with pipelines. Pipelines will take 3, 4, 5 years at least to develop these projects. Nord Stream far longer, which is why it's such a shock. Where at the point where Nord Stream 2 actually physically is completed, it falls down at the final hurdle when due to geopolitics. We've had other pipelines, similar stories. The Dolphin gas pipeline between Qatar and the United Arab Emirates. You know, we wind the clock back to 2007. That project, it started its conception at about 2000. That's when the negotiations started. I think they started to break ground around 2010, 2003. One of the main international investors in that project went bankrupt, which was Enron. They had to find new investors. Eventually, when it was built in 2007, a diplomatic row between Saudi Arabia and the UAE blew up in the UAE's face. Saudi was writing them letters saying, we don't want this pipeline to go ahead. It runs through our territory. That goes all the way back to you know, tribal disputes actually over land and the demarcation of sea borders between you know, Gulf Emirates, which just illustrate. I mean, of course, that pipeline is in operation now, and you know, gas continues to flow. But cross-border pipelines are problematic and complicated, legally fraught, and profoundly vulnerable to geopolitical changes in governments and to regional politics. So. You know, the idea that we're going to see more, you know, Russian commodities flowing to Asia. Yes, we already are seeing that. But you know, more pipelines into Asia. That's going to take time. It's going to take investment, and much of that investment, if it ever happens, is going to have to come from China. You know, from the Chinese perspective, they may look and think, well, actually, you know, we're prepared to cooperate with Russia. On many levels, we're prepared to deal with Russia as a trading partner, and we're prepared, you know, not to oppose Russia's actions in Ukraine to the extent that other countries have. but we don't really want to be totally dependent on Russian supplies of energy, because China, 70% of its oil is imported. Yeah. They may look and see the Gulf states as being better partners long term, more stable, more reliable to deal with, and less likely to suffer regime change. And you know, this is another thing that you can't discount. You know, with Russia, and you know, you just have to wind back to how Putin took power from Boris Yeltsin, how that was facilitated, to see that this is possible. And again, it comes back to the point previously that we can't rule anything out in today's world, and we have to think of these scenarios. I think, you know, the whole issue around de-risking exposure from different parts of the world, whether it's Russia or the Middle East, you know, it's tricky because there are few alternatives. Right. And we've seen that in the new UK energy policy document that was published yesterday, the energy security strategy going forward. Big mentions for nuclear, big mentions for offshore wind, for renewables. There was a mention to start encouraging more drilling in the North Sea, but the reality is the North Sea has you know, a reserves base recoverable still of about 22 billion barrels of crude. Saudi Arabia has reserves in excess of 280 billion barrels of crude. You know, shale has been prolific in the US, but shale is dependent on financing from bankers. And shale in the last 5-6 year cycle hasn't been as profitable as it was 10 years ago. So the bankers have been less encouraged to actually invest, and that's why you've seen a lower level of drilling. So I think it's this issue of resource scarcity, and that there are actually in reality few alternatives. Renewables, like I mentioned with pipelines, it takes time. It's not just a question of building a wind farm on top of a mountain or out at sea. Although wind in theory can be constructed fairly quickly, there are rules, there are regulations, and there are planning, and it all adds to the time process required. And actually the problems the world faces at the moment, you know, it's been condensed. We used to talk about these problems over the space of 10 years, you know, being realized. Now it's the space of a year. We have to come up with a solution to de-risk from Russian energy in Europe, and the UK, and to a lesser extent as well, the US, because all these markets are interconnected. So it's very complicated.
It's very true, Andy. And of course, you know, looking at China, I found it very interesting that its third largest supplier of hydrocarbons is Brazil. So clearly they are looking well beyond their local neighborhood, and diversification is the name of the game for them. I agree with you entirely. The last thing they want is to make themselves more dependent on Russia. How they'll deal with Kazakhstan as a supplier while not offending Russia is a different matter, but I think a weaker Russia is probably in China's long-term interest. That said, Andy, I'm assuming that if you're a betting man, you would probably look at what's happening in Ukraine and Russia and see that there is going to be two massive economic black holes for the next 10, 20 years. Do you think addressing particularly Ukraine's economic reconstruction as a boon or as a drain on the global economy? And if China is freezing itself out of that theater as an honest broker, Ukrainians would turn to the West instead of China, right? What do you think?
I think, again, it's a very good point. I can only think back to 2003 and when I was a reporter in Iraq and looking at how one, the billions of dollars that were pumped into Iraq via the Coalition Provisional Authority and the reconstruction program in Iraq, and how so much of that money was wasted, abused. I look at Iraq now. Did it make a massive substantive difference to infrastructure, to the lives of Iraqis on the ground? I'm not convinced.
Or Afghanistan, Andy, the same.
And Afghanistan, the same. Is there the political will in Western nations, or actually, you know, is there the money to fund reconstruction programs on a scale that you saw in Iraq and Afghanistan. These reconstruction programs are always geared to benefit the economies that are providing the cash. So in the case of Iraq, US contractors receive preferential treatment on contracts. US international oil companies, were certainly given an inside track to get access to Iraq and to open negotiations with Iraq over access to resources. In Afghanistan, again, a lot of the reconstruction funding, it was tied via USAID to US companies. Likewise with the UK and with other donors. So it's open to abuse and it's open to failure. It's an imperfect system. It doesn't really work. But I just question, given the post-pandemic world, whether the West actually has the money to go in there and fund reconstruction, because I haven't been on the ground in Ukraine. I'm just looking at the images and what I've seen reported, but you can see that the bill for reconstruction is going to be as big, if not bigger, given the size of the country, than what we saw in Iraq and Afghanistan. Iraq, of course, had the bonus that it sits on 100 billion barrels plus of crude oil, which was a huge enticement for the US and Western powers to not just invade in 2003 in the first place, but also to actually occupy and to reconstruct the country. Would it be China that goes in and funds that? I find that difficult to believe, because I think it is something that would drive a big wedge between Russia and China going forward. And I think that in terms of China's achieving its foreign policy goals, I think that they will walk very carefully here, which actually puts Ukraine in a really tough position, because I just don't see where the funding to actually rebuild Ukraine, the economic support, is actually going to come from. I really don't see that coming from the EU or the US at the moment, because actually towards the final quarter of this year, when what we're seeing in commodity prices starts to really be realized on the ground in people's wallets, it's the final quarter of this year that people should be concerned about, because that's when you're going to get the dramatic rises in food price inflation. It's when people's, the wholesale gas prices that utilities in Europe and the UK are locking in now, that's all going to be realized in 6-7 months' time, when those prices hit the retail market, because the price cap will have to increase. So again, this is all, the timing is terrible, because I think that these democracies in the West are going to be more focused. And then you come back to the US at the end of the year, November, you've got midterms where inflation, whether it's at the pumps or such supply chain inflation, which is really going to start to affect that campaign. If we have peace in Ukraine at that point, and it's a big question, and we are then starting to discuss the concept of reconstruction, I just can't see where the money's going to come from. Unless it is a massive IMF-led, international donor-led process, and the politics of that are very complicated to negotiate, when historically donors have attached aid to their own economic interests via contracts, companies, entities that can win that work.
Well, this is all fascinating. So I want to ask you two quick questions, Andy. One is that, given the price of commodities and food shortage, and you cover everything, not only oil and gas and energy, are we flirting around an Arab Spring 2.0 if the bread revolutions are back? Number one. What is the significance of BRI? Forget about Ukraine, but Build Back Better World and all of that, for reconstruction of some of Levant, and where that energy as well should come from in oil and gas, because reconstruction needs energy. And should we move into a scenario of walled neighborhoods? Wouldn't Asia or Heartland, in a geostrategic realpolitik point of view, have the food and the energy and be in a more advantageous position comparing to the posturings across the Atlantic? What are your thoughts?
Well, I'll tackle the last question first. I think that Asia is in a better position, and I think it's in a better position because of its proximity to Australia. And I think actually some of the geopolitics around Australia is very interesting. The extent to which the US now, is really has Australia as one as its major ally in the region. I think it's now 9-10 years since the US put its first boots on the ground, opened a military camp in Darwin. That was pretty significant because it gave the US closer proximity to being able to protect Australia in terms of its natural resources. The Australian government are profoundly insecure around Chinese expansionism in the South China Sea and what that means for its own resources. China is dependent on Australia more than any other country for its economic growth. It's a major importer of Australian iron ore, Australian copper, Australian resources. Australia really is a breadbasket, and outside Russia, it's one of these, well, they call it the lucky country, right? And it's right on the doorstep of Asia. So the proximity of Australia to these Asian countries, I think, is very important in this story, because it does give Asia as a region a strategic advantage that is harder to see in Europe, because actually, if not physically, I think politically, a lot of these resources are getting further away now for Europe. And whether it's ags, metals imports from Russia, whether it's energy in the form of coal, gas, oil from Russia, whether it's the Middle East, that relationship between Middle East oil producers and European nations is weaker than it was 10, 15 years ago. The same for all those things can be said of the US, I think. So I think that's a kind of important kind of thing to kind of focus on here. The first, I've made the mistake here of answering the third question when I should have answered the first one.
The first one was Arab Spring 2.0 because of price.
Oh yeah, I think without doubt, I think this is a major concern, and the UAE Energy Minister Suhail Al-Mazroui said so much. I think it was at the Atlantic Council last week in Dubai. I think he was asked what his biggest concern was, and he said food security. When you start in the Gulf states and you're pretty much entirely dependent on food imports, and again, I think it really does indicate actually how much the Arab Spring rattled the governments in the Gulf region and really concerned them. And I'm absolutely sure that this is on their radar, and it's something that's being closely watched. And Egypt moved very quickly 3 weeks ago to ban wheat exports, knowing that what was going to start to hit in the next quarter, the next several months, in terms of consumer price inflation in across North Africa. That's only going to intensify because all the inputs, and now we're seeing it in fertilizer markets. Fertilizer needs gas prices. We've had these 300% increases in, if you look at Europe, TTF prices over the last year, absolutely staggering. Gas, the primary feedstock for creating fertilizer prices globally are going through the roof. So we're only at the start of the sort of price inflation that you're going to see in ags in the next year. So I'm really concerned about the prospect, what this means for some of the Arab, for some of the more fragile Arab countries, especially in North Africa.
So that tallies very, very well, and even what we are seeing on the ground, that suddenly there is this rapid response to Egypt in particular of investments going in from the Gulf states, now including Qatar, in trying to beef it up. But of course, Egypt is just one of many potentially starving Arab countries that I don't think the resources are going to stretch that far, otherwise they become very thin. And you see this kind of pockets of vulnerability right across the region that you've rightly pointed to. But if hydrocarbon prices continue to remain high, and for me that's questionable, given that I think we're going into a prospect of a recession in the next 18 months or so, that will have a dramatic impact on energy prices in any case. So do you see a double whammy of flatlining oil prices affecting the exporters in the first instance, but also trimming their ability to blow up balloons under the fragile allies in the region and beyond? How do you see them looking forward and not seeing dark corners?
I think this is, I think your question really has a lot of significance to what OPEC is doing at the moment. I think that OPEC's policy at the moment isn't just focused on the fundamentals in the oil market. And of course, there's lots of concerns over demand around, and this is near-term demand over what you've seen in China around some of the lockdowns in looking at COVID. China's so important for the oil market going forward. Of course, they've been put under a lot of pressure to pump more crude to ease some of this price pressure off the market, bring crude down below $100 a barrel. But I think the point here is you're absolutely right that if you look at the core Gulf state producers, they all need oil prices above $80 a barrel, in my view, at least, not just to balance their budgets, but actually to create surpluses, because balancing budgets actually for Gulf states is quite easy, because so much of their big spending is discretionary. It's actually off balance sheet. So actually, if you look at the budgets of a lot of Gulf states, they're actually relatively small when you look at some of the major spending projects that they put into action. So in Saudi Arabia, for example, they announced NEOM, huge new city project on the Red Sea coast, with a big dollar tag attached to it, and people think, well, how are they paying for that in the budget? The answer is they're not, because it's like most of these major Gulf infrastructure projects, it's all off balance sheet. And Gulf states have been very good at creating these pools of capital to be able to do that historically. Some of them are called sovereign wealth funds, some of them are via state-owned enterprises. But ultimately, coming back to oil policy, you need cash to be able to do that. I think that this is feeding into OPEC policy at the moment, because actually the Gulf states need oil above $100 a barrel, because I think that they do have one eye on everything that you're talking about, Anush, in terms of these early signs that there could be trouble ahead, especially in the fragile states of North Africa, and then having to fund that. And we saw that post-Arab Spring, where there was literally a flood of Gulf money going into these countries to stabilize them, to hold them up. And that is starting to happen again. That will only increase as this inflationary cycle continues, because we're really only at the start of it. So then it makes it almost impossible for these OPEC producers at the core of the group in the case at the moment, to release more oil, because they're still returning oil to the market from the massive cut that they had to introduce at the beginning of COVID-19. But they're not going to go any quicker because of this massive risk on their doorstep.
Andy, it's fascinating. We normally close this dialogues with two standard questions, which I'll come to very quickly. But you talked about the power of OPEC, and I think in terms of as a non-governmental institute or organization with clout and power, as you rightly said, but members of OPEC themselves are all very vulnerable to regime change and sanctions. Case in point, Venezuela, which 2 weeks ago received congressmen going to talk, and can you give us some oil extra? And you ask, where is Juan Guaido, el presidente? The politics of oil is fascinating. So you must be in a hall of mirrors every day, Andy, and we salute you for your insight. But two questions from an energy point of view: what would be your two messages to the cynophobes and cinephiles along the BRI? So what would be the message of somebody with your expertise on the future of China, even if you're a cinephobe or a cinephile? Where's your parting shot?
My message is that keep a very close eye on China's relationship with the core Gulf states, because that's the future. And this is the paradigm shift. The Carter Doctrine is dying, if not dead, and in the sense that the US will come charging to the rescue of Gulf states from a security perspective. Yes, they'll sell arms technology to the Gulf. They'll provide some support, but I believe that the idea of major interventions in the region, that's gone. Now, the big thing to look at, to answer to your question, is whether China will actually start to think seriously about having a security footprint in the region. And this is where you get the flashpoint. And this is where the real test for diplomacy in the future is going to come. Because certainly from the perspective of traditional US client states in the region, they are aware that there has been a US withdrawal, and we've seen that in the recent upswing in militant attacks on oil infrastructure in the Gulf, where actually there was a withdrawal of missile defense a year ago, and that created huge tension. And then we haven't even started talking about it. I mean, we could do another podcast about Iran and the talks around restoring sanctions and the US position on that, and China and Russia for that matter. And it's so complicated. But to come to your point, I think that this relationship between China, Saudi Arabia, the UAE going forward, this is a tipping point, and it's a real signal of a shift in this power balance, which is going to transform the Middle East, transform it. It's fascinating.
Andy, you should be careful what you wish for. So
yes.
Yes. So you're on the record with Ali and I that you want to come back and take another grand tour with us, which we'll accept with great pleasure. So you've already talked yourself into that one. I normally have the honor of closing our dialogues, but to be honest, I really don't want to let you go, because Critchlow 2 has been even more excited than Critchlow 1. And what we are learning from you is extraordinary, from the politics of domestic politics of states, to geopolitical shifts, to the role that commodities will continue to. Remember, commodities used to be the subject of geography in the last century, and here we are into this century still pivoting around commodities. And your command of this range of issues that is shaping all of our lives is extraordinary. I can only put it down to your Durham education, of course, but that would only be the beginning, because what you've done with your Durham education, the experience you've had, is now shining a light on all these corners that we all look at worryingly. You haven't given us much to cheer about, but at least you've made us forewarned about what to expect and where the problems are coming from. And that is exactly what our dialogues are designed to do, to bring insights of experts like yourself and to help educate us, but also show us the way and help us avoid the potholes if we can at all. So Ali and I thank you from the bottom of our heart for coming twice, but also for exceeding expectations that we would have had from a conversation about energy to so many other things that you've done. So our gratitude is expressed very warmly. Andy, thank you so much.
Thank you, Andy.
Thank you, Anush. Thank you, Ali. That's really very kind. And I've got you to blame, Anush, entirely. I had the best of teachers in yourself. I really did. And I always, when people talk to me about the Middle East, which is my passion, as well as a big part of my job, I always recount I have a cookbook actually that you gave me, and I've got an inscription on the inside page that I won you used to do a kind of role-playing scenario exercise where around the peace process.
Yeah.
And this was a whole day in the Center for Middle East and Islamic Studies, I remember at the time, where we went over trying to resolve the Middle East problems via a negotiation, and it just became, and everyone had a role, and it just became so nefarious, and it just kind of really kind of but there was a lesson to it that was really important, how complex the Middle East is. It's a web